Disclaimer. This book may contain content that is considered historically inaccurate or culturally insensitive by modern standards. My hope is that by exploring old literature, we will better understand why people of the past thought the way that they did and understand the influences that shape their culture. This video is not intended for young audiences. Context note, staged pants are a sort of short pants that are not floor length, and that's to avoid getting caught on brush in the woods. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I'm excited to read you from Paul Bunyan by James Stephens. The He-Man Country. In Paul Bunyan's time, the He-Man country was far from its present tame and safe condition. It was then a high, smooth valley, which lay between the Cascade Mountains and the Rockies. The highest peaks towered only a few hundred feet above it. Down the center of the valley, Moron River flowed, and on each side of this amazing stream, the sage trees grew, the wild horses roved, and the long-eared, stub-tailed high-behind sat with lifted front feet and savagely sniffed the air for the scent of their hereditary enemy, the blonde wolf. There, too, the tiger monks lifted their tails and screamed in the moonlight. The professors maintained that the tiger monks, the blonde wolves, and the high-behinds got their great size from eating prune pits, which were thrown out from Paul Bunyan's cookhouse, and that they were all shot by the settlers who followed the great logger. This notion is ridiculous. The truth is that these animals were cowards at heart, but this should be told at the end of the story. Paul Bunyan moved to this region after his disastrous experience in New Iowa, when his loggers all turned poets. He depended on the He-Man country to make plain, honest men out of them again. The super-masculine sage trees, he was sure, would inspire them to anything but poetry, and the logging off of these hard forests would be a historical achievement. But the great logger left nothing to chance. He remembered a species of animal which his boss farmer, John Shears, had originated, and he ordered a herd of them to be brought west. John Shears had proved to him that the virility of buffalo milk was incomparable. So Paul Bunyan planned to stuff his loggers with buffalo milk hotcakes as an antidote to any poison of poetry that might remain in them. Thus, the great logger's first move in the He-Man country was to build a great buffalo corral and milking pen. When it was completed, the buffaloes were brought from the old home camp, and a gang of scissorbills came along to herd and milk them. After their first breakfast of the new man food, the loggers got some of their old swagger back, and Paul Bunyan was a picture of cheerfulness as he cruised the sage trees and planned the work of his men. Moron River offered a chance for the most eventful and picturesque drive of logging history. From its source above the border to its mouth on the Oregon coast, it was like a huge child of a river, for it flowed ridiculously in every mile of its course. Here it ran smoothly for a short distance, then it would flow jerkily, making spasmodic waves. Again, its surface would form into vast eddies that whirled like merry-go-rounds, and from these the waters rushed into heaving rolls of foam. There were quicksands where the river played hide-and-seek, nearly disappearing in places, miles where it turned and ran back, and then curved into its course again, making a perfect figure-8. Moron River flowed everywhere in zigzags and curlicues, cutting all manner of capers and didos. Any man but Paul Bunyan would have admitted the impossibility of making a drive on it, but he only smiled when he saw it and said, If my rivermen will forget poetry, they can drive it easily." The timber in this high, wide valley reached from the eastern slopes of the Cascade Hills to the western slopes of the Rockies. These sage trees resembled the desert sagebrush of today. They were not large. Few of them were over 200 feet in height, and not one of them could give a butt log over 9 feet in diameter. But they all had many massive limbs which were crowded with silver-gray leaves, each leaf being the size of a number 12 shoe. The brown bark of the sage trees was thick, loose, and stringy. It would have to be peeled from the logs before they were snaked to the landings by the blue ox. Splendid work for the swampers and limbers, said Paul Bunyan, as he cruised the timber. What a noble logging land is the He-Man country! Surely my loggers will be reborn here, into even better men than they were before they fell into an illness of poetry and ideas. The first day of logging in the He-Man country seemed to justify the great loggers as best hosts. The men came out from breakfast with a swinging, swaggering tramp, loudly smacking their lips over the lingering flavors of buffalo milk hotcakes. This potent food made them vigorously he and every action. Each man chewed at least 3 cans of Copenhagen and a quarter-pound of fire-cut during his first 12 hours in the woods. But-tooey sounded everywhere among shouted oaths and coarse bellowing. Every axe stroke buried the bit deeply in the tough sage wood, and brown dust spurted and gushed constantly from every singing saw. Crash, crash, crash! The thunder of falling trees sounded like a heavy cannonade. On all the loggers' backs, gray sweat stains spread from under their suspenders, and their hair hung in dripping strings over their red, wet faces. They had got up steam for the first time since leaving the Hickory Hill country, and they were rejoicing in it. Even after the 11th hour had passed, their eyes were bright, though red-rimmed from stinging sweat, though wrinkles of weariness had formed around them. The men were tired indeed. The fallers and swampers were now panting through open mouths, and they were chewing nervously on their tongues, as is the habit of men who are wearied out. As is the habit of men when they are wearied out. But they never missed a lick, and when Paul Bunyan called them home, they could still walk springily. When they were back in camp, they did not even complain of the smeared, sticky feeling which always follows great sweats. No one spoke delicately of bathing. The loggers all washed and combed carelessly, and soon they made a trembling, growling host around the cookhouse door. The rafters and beams of the great cookhouse shook at this supper. So savagely did the loggers tackle the platters of bear meat. Even the bones were crushed, ground, and devoured. And Hot Biscuit Slim and his helpers were delighted when all the dishes were left slick and clean. That night, no poems were recited in the bunkhouses, but the loggers roared out, "The Jam on Gary's Walk," and other plain old songs. The loggers all crawled into their blankets at an early hour, and every one of them emitted gruff snores as soon as he went to sleep. Paul Bunyan listened to them, and he praised the saints for the He-Man country. Had it not been for this region, there was no telling what continuous plagues of poetry would have afflicted his simple men. Now they were back to normalcy. The loggers continued to improve as summer passed and the short autumn of the He-Man country ran its course. The first snow of the cold season fell on a redeemed camp. That snow flew in on a thundering wind. Its flakes quickly made masses of dry snow around the bunkhouse doors, and these were swept into huge drifts that were window-high in places when the breakfast gong rang. The loggers roared and cheered when they rushed out for their buffalo milk hotcakes. Paul Bunyan listened to their basso growls of hunger, their rumbling, jovial cursing, their bellows of laughter, and he chuckled so heartily that the snow which had gathered on his beard was shaken over a crowd of loggers, burying them. They dug themselves out, whooping their appreciation of the humorous happening, and they jestfully shook their fists at their chuckling leader. Then, without stopping to dig the snow from their shirt collars, they galloped on for the steaming cookhouse. The stamping and banging, the clatter and crash, the smoking, sucking, and grinding of mealtime had never sounded with more vigor and power than on this wild winter morning. Breakfast done, the loggers came forth wiping their mouths with flourishing swipes of their fists, and with much snorting, thumb-blowing of noses. When they were back in the bunkhouses, they laced up their boots, arguing loudly the while as to whether true savages, real tough bullies, would wear mackinaws when it was only 40 below zero. "Mackinaws!" yelled the majority. "Where's your red bully blood, you hunkoys? Mackinaws! Hell no, burleys! We won't even button the collars of our shirts!" And then Ford Fordson, camp tinker, bunkhouse handyman, and prophet, got an idea which swiftly ran through all the bunkhouses. "Real rough, red-blooded, burly, bully, savage, dirt-stomping, ear-chewing, tobacco-loving, whisker-growing, hell-roaring He-Men are not doing to wear their boots and pants like we've been doing," said he. "Look you now, here's a 10-inch boot top, here are 2 inches of wool socks above it, and there's a pants's leg all tucked down nice and pretty inside of it. Mates, it looks too delicate. It is no way for a fire-eating logger to wear his duds." Here now, watch me and do as I do, and be a real band of honest-to-God bullies. This way, look." He jerked open his horn-handled old knife, and he slashed off the legs of his tin breeches, his mackinaw pants, and his overalls, just below his knees. He bit off a jaw full of flour-cut, and then stood up, his fists on his hips, an unshaven cheek bulging with pepper-flavored tobacco, shapeless hat down over one eye, collar unbuttoned, suspenders stretching over his expanded chest, and, high mark of all high marks, distinction of distinctions, his pants ending in ragged edges below his knees. An inch of red drawers' legs showed below them. There followed bands of green wool socks, then black boot tops, sagged pants, the finishing touch. Poetry was crushed to earth, never to rise triumphantly again in Paul Bunyan's camp. The inventive and prophetic Fordson had about killed it. The great leader was delighted beyond words when he saw the loggers in their new costumes. He smiled indulgently when he heard some of the more modest among them saying that the brush would not bother them greatly now, and that Fordson's invention was a mighty good, useful one. This is the reason loggers of today give for stagging their pants. But Paul Bunyan knew that his men had all taken up with invention because it suited their natures, which had come back to them. Most of them, indeed, admitted it. The loggers of our time should also be frank and admit that stagged pants spring from the he-bulliness of their souls. As Paul Bunyan said, etiquette, dainty speech, sweet sense, poetry, and delicate clothes belong properly in the drawing-room, the study, and the sanctum. They are hothouse growths. Loggers should take pride in hard labor and rough living. Anything that helps their heasomeness makes them better men. All glory to you, Fordson, for the invention of stagged pants. He offered the bunkhouse genius his little finger. Fordson got his arms a fourth of the way around it, and the two inventors shook hands. The months went on, and the loggers' rugged virtues continued to gain strength from the virile buffalo milk hotcakes. They did noble work among the sage trees, and felled so many of them that the big Swede and the blue ox had to go in a gallop during their working hours to snake all the logs to the landings. Now, this was the year which is mentioned in history as the year of the hard winter. But the bitterest cold could not now chill the blood of Paul Bunyan's he-men. They had never been so jolly as they were this Christmas, and they jigged and chortled when Paul Bunyan gave each of them a knife devised especially for pants stagging. The great leader had cut out thousands of these excellent presents from two of Babe's old ox shoes. This was the merriest holiday season the camp had ever known, and even the incredible cold of New Year's Day did not lessen the noisy bunkhouse gaiety. On the last night of the old year, the mercury in the great thermometer which hung on the camp office had dropped to 400 degrees below zero. Then the tube burst, and no one could tell the temperature, but it got appreciably colder. The next morning, the boiling coffee froze on the stove, despite the desperate stoking of the kitchen firemen, and the loggers had to drink hot brown ice for their morning's breakfast. But they tramped cheerfully to work, nevertheless, cracking their mittened hands together and stamping the ground as they went along. They worked so hard to keep warm on this day that they talked and swore but little. This was fortunate, for on this incomparable New Year's Day, every spoken word froze solidly in the air as soon as it was uttered. The next day the temperature rose, but the words remained frozen, and many a logger bumped his mouth by walking into the hellos and dams which were solid in the air. But the hardy victims only laughed through their split lips at such accidents. These words all thawed out at once on a warmer day. They melted in one long drawn-out, mournful echoing shout, so unhumanly humorous in sound that the loggers rolled with laughter to hear it. Cold as the winter was, Paul Bunyan and his men were reluctant to see it go, for every day had brought some tickling incident. But at last the gray frost crystals began to glitter occasionally from rays of sunshine which filtered through the white winter mists. Then Paul Bunyan began to plan for the hazardous historical drive down Moron River. Spring was at hand, and the great logger remembered his old whimsical query: if springtime comes, can drives be far behind? The loggers, too, sensed the approach of the driving season, and every night the bunkhouses rang with sounds of filing as the rivermen sharpened cocks, pike poles, and peavies. They bellowed the old driving songs as never before, and the floors shook as they leaped and pranced to show the marvelous springiness of their legs. They got so comradely in their merriment and exuberance that the last poet among them ventured a poem which began, "It's all very well to be profane when life is as dark as night, but the man worth a fuss is the man who can cuss when everything round him is bright." He got no further, for in an instant one bully had him down, chewing savagely on his ear, while others raked his ribs with their cocks. It was the last sigh of poetry in the camp. Paul Bunyan heard about it and had one of the happiest hours of his life as he rejoiced over the good news. "But every silver cloud has its shadows," he said sensibly when his exultation had passed. "I still expect great troubles and difficulties." He was wise indeed in this thought, for he got a troublous problem at once. Sure as the great logger had been that the powerful buffalo milk hotcakes could only do good for his loggers, sure as he was that they could not give his men too much red blood or make them too hellishly heave, Paul Bunyan had yet failed to reckon on the dire effects that the virile food might have on weaker men. He had given no thought to the scissor-bills who herded and milked the buffaloes. Throughout the fall, these men had shown nothing but their usual tameness and amiability. During the hard winter, they had shivered silently by their campfires, but now they began to show that the powerful food was having a terrific effect on them. Many of the buffaloes had died during the cold spell, and the scissor-bills had made pants from their shaggy hides. Some of the high behinds had frozen also, and the scissor-bills had taken their skins and made tall, flapping hats of them. Colds had afflicted them during the winter, and for convenience they had tied their handkerchiefs around their necks. They took a fancy to this fashion, and let the handkerchiefs remain after their colds were gone. Their next outbreak of virility was to unravel one of Babe's halter ropes, and arrange a long little rope with a noose end from each thread of it. They practiced throwing nooses over the posts of the buffalo corral fence until they became quite expert in casting them. The scissor-bills then caught wild horses with their ropes and broke them for riding. Then they got to be a crazy, noisy gang after this, and Paul Bunyan began to notice them as they rode through the sage trees, yipping shrilly. And then one morning they came to the hero leader and requested that they be called scissor-bills no longer, but Buffalo Boys. Instead, Paul Bunyan admired their shaggy pants, their neckerchiefs, and their tall hats, and he thoughtlessly consented to their wishes. He did not feel that the scissor-bills had it in them to become real he-men, but he was not a man to discourage worthy ambitions. But Paul Bunyan soon had reason to remember one of his old sayings, that the road from the palace of generosity leads through a forest of perils. His one kindly gesture towards the lowly scissor-bills made them a powerful faction in the he-man country, and a fierce rivalry between them and the loggers soon developed, for they insisted on being called Buffalo Boys, and Paul Bunyan's best men saw an intolerable dignity in the title. The Buffalo Boys painted large BBs on their hats. They painted the letters on the buffaloes and on their horses also. At calving time, they devised some irons in the shape of double B's, and they branded the buffalo calves with them. The Buffalo Boys grew even bolder. They began to ride among the bunkhouses in the evenings, yipping and yelling at the men who were earnestly preparing for the greatest drive of history. Such impudence was not long tolerated, of course, and it got so that every morning found Buffalo Boys mourning for lost ears and doctoring the wounds made by sharp cocks. But buffalo milk was running hot in their veins, and their new courage carried them to still greater extremes. One morning, when the loggers came to work, they found that every sage tree had BB burned into its bark. That day, the drive was not talked about, for the loggers plotted vengeance as they toiled. This night, they turned the buffaloes out of their corral, and the Buffalo Boys were out until morning rounding up the herd. The following night, they, in turn, galloped past the bunkhouses and roped every stovepipe that stuck above a roof. They dragged them into the timber and hid them, and the loggers had to dress by cold stoves the next morning. That evening, during milking time, the loggers slipped into the Buffalo Boys' tents and poured water into their blankets. The next morning, the loggers found their boots all filled with ice, for the Buffalo Boys had played such an evil trick on them during the night. The astonishing audacity of these lowly creatures was not to be longer endured. Lord Boku and his followers would not listen to the pleas of the moderates that the punishment of the Buffalo Boys be left until the drive was finished. The bunkhouse cranks had grown savage in the He-Man country, and they now threw aside all restraint. They yelled their rage until all the loggers got excited, and in a short time the bunkhouses were empty, and the loggers were marching on the Buffalo Boys' camp. They closed in silently and attacked with a lion-like ferocity. The Buffalo Boys, their timidity vanished now, stood up and gave vigorous battle. When Paul Bunyan stepped into camp and called, "Roll out, my bullies! Roll out for the big drive!" he got no answer. Then he looked toward the buffalo corral and saw a sea of dust surging over miles of the valley. All over the gray surface of this sea, fists were flashing up as whitecaps jump and fall on wind-blown waters. Paul Bunyan leaped towards the scene of conflict. But the great loggers' endeavors to separate the fighters were vain. But the great logger's endeavors to separate the fighters were vain. When he got among them, he had to stand still for fear of trampling them. The Buffalo Boys and the loggers crowded against his feet as they clinched and punched, and some of them rolled under the arches of his boots. He ordered the factions to their camps, but they would not hear. Then Paul Bunyan bellowed. The battlers were all thrown down, but they bounced up fighting. Ears and fingers were now flying up everywhere in the dust, and the leader was alarmed by the thought that a more fearful condition was in sight than even poetry had threatened to bring about. The ferocious masculinity that his two gangs of men had got from the virile hotcakes would leave him with camps of earless and fingerless cripples. Disaster loomed over the logging industry once more, his brain racing like a dynamo as it conceived desperate ideas. Paul Bunyan failed to notice at first that the dust sea had mysteriously vanished, though the struggle still raged. Not until he saw all the loggers and Buffalo Boys stop fighting and throw themselves on the ground, each man clutching at his own legs and howling with fear, did he realize that an unnatural happening was saving his men from exterminating each other. Every frantic fighter was howling, "My boots is running over with blood! I'm a goner sure!" Paul Bunyan heard them with amazement, and with amazement he gazed on the valleys and hills. A thin mist was rising from the ground. It vanished soon. Then Paul Bunyan saw that rain was springing from the earth, falling up, if the term may be used, for many feet, and then dropping back again. The first shower had rained up the legs of the Buffalo Boys and the loggers, and they had mistaken it for blood. Now they were still rolling, moaning and bellowing. Paul Bunyan's amazement soon passed, for he was accustomed to unnatural seasons, climates, and happenings. He was all delight that the unusual rain had stopped the battle, and he saw no harm in it yet. He did not know that this was a rain of such tremendous force that it had poured through the earth. For this was the spring that the rain came up from China. Harder and harder the rain came up, and it was not long before the loggers and the Buffalo Boys opened their eyes and stopped their yelling. They were soaked all over now, and they knew that the sudden warm wetness of their legs had not been from blood. Paul Bunyan laughed through his beard, which was high and dry, when he saw his men begin to run for the camp to get out of the strange rain. The fight was forgotten, and the logging industry was saved. The ground hissed as the rain came up with new violence. The drops became streams. The streams doubled, trebled, and in an hour there were 10 streams where only one had come up before. The rain became a downpour, or an uppour rather. It got the proportions of a cloudburst, or perhaps it should be said, an earthburst. The hillocks and hummocks had forests of small fountains, and the low places pools were forming, and these boiled with muddy foam as myriads of miniature geysers spurted up from them. Paul Bunyan, feeling great satisfaction over the happy ending the rain had given to the conflict, Paul Bunyan, feeling great satisfaction over the happy ending the rain had given to the conflict between his two tribes, did not at first realize the danger to his recent logging operations from the unnatural rain. When he did think of the logs piled along the river, he ran swiftly to look after them. He was too late. Moron River had already risen far over its banks, and all of the brown, peeled sage logs, the fruit of a season's labor, were now tossing on a muddy flood. The rain was coming up through the river in sheets. Torrents were pouring into the stream from every small gully. The water was rising at the rate of a foot a minute. It would soon be in the camp grounds. Paul Bunyan made no attempt to retrieve his lost logs. He now rushed to save his camp. The loggers had turned their bunkhouses upside down because the rain had come up through the floors. They had then set their bunks on the rafters, and they were now snug and dry, for the rain could not pour up through the tight roofs. The loggers left their cozy quarters reluctantly when they heard Paul Bunyan call, "Roll out or roll up." They could imagine nothing more disagreeable than its raining up their pants' legs, however. They could imagine nothing more disagreeable than its raining up their pants' legs, rough he-men though they were. But when they saw the river rising in rushing waves, they did not need Paul Bunyan's orders to make them run for the cookhouse. Johnny Inkslinger was wiring the camp office, and Babe's stable to the Mammoth building, and the big Swede was making his fastest move since the Dakota days as he hitched up the blue ox. Paul Bunyan roared, "Yay, Babe!" just as the river waters thundered into camp. The blue ox plunged towards the Cascade Hills. He dragged the three greatest buildings of the camp and all the loggers to safety, but the bunkhouses were rolling over and over in the flood. Paul Bunyan and his two aides saved 2 of the buffalo boys, 2 buffaloes, 2 high-behinds, 2 tiger monks, 2 blonde wolves, and 2 wild horses from the raging waters, but all other life perished. For 40 days and 40 nights it rained up from China, and then the flood receded. Paul Bunyan and his men looked down from the Cascades and saw that all of the old He-Man country had been washed away. It was now a low valley. There was sage in it still, but the sage was only brush. Ridges and butts of gray rock were all of the old land that remained. There was no longer any logging in the greater part of it, but here on the new slopes of the Cascades was a more cheerful sight. For the old land over the slopes had covered a magnificent forest of white pine, which was even finer than that around the old home camp. The loggers shouted when they saw it, and was it a tear, that gleam of moisture in Paul Bunyan's beard? If so, it was from his new happiness. "It's an ill rain," he chuckled, "that brings no logger wood." The 2 buffalo boys, like the loggers, still heroic from their virile winter's diet, had come through their ordeal in good shape, and the buffaloes had slept all the 40 days and nights. But the other poor animals, the wild horses, were wild no longer. They had become tame, and would now eat sugar out of any man's hand. The buffalo boys nicknamed them Broncos. Their high-behinds, the blonde wolves, and the tiger monks were all cowards at heart, and they had been scared out of 20 years' growth. Not one of them was knee-high to a logger now. The big Swede made his first and only joke about the tiger monks, who had been scared into the size of chips. "Tiger monks," he grinned. "I think these are been chipmunks." And chipmunks they have been called ever since. Paul Bunyan's history does not tell how the high-behinds came to be named jackrabbits, or how the blonde wolves came to be named coyotes. No doubt they were also named humorously, for the loggers were gay when the rain no longer came up from China. Anyhow, the old names are no longer used in the He-Man country. Thank you for listening to The He-Man Country from Paul Bunyan by James Stephens with me. I hope that you return soon to hear the next story, and have a great day. Bye!